Now, migrants, the failure to stop illegal migration to the UK, that really is the story of the moment, because this government's much shouted about stop the boats agenda is a massive, massive failure. Their supposed small boats week, which was last week, saw the first migrants boarding the Bibby Stockholm barge just off the coast of Dorset before they had to rapidly disembark it following a Legionella outbreak. At least 6 more people died in the Channel over the weekend. And now hearing ever more frenzied cries from some quarters to simply turn the boats back. And look, that's not a fix, is it? Remember, this was one of the Prime Minister's 5 pledges, Rishi Sunak promising everyone that he would get control of the borders.
What I hear when someone says, well, if someone comes here and claims asylum illegally, they come here illegally and they claim an asylum, I hear that and say that's wrong, right? When I hear that someone has paid thousands of pounds to come here and exploit our world-leading modern slavery laws, that's wrong. We have to fix all those things. The system that we need, the system that I want to introduce, is one whereby if you come here illegally, you should be swiftly detained, and then in a matter of days or weeks, we will hear your claim, not months and years, and then we will safely remove you somewhere else. And if we do that, that's how we'll break the cycle.
Rishi Sunak speaking to our very own Piers Morgan there. And this idea, and it's not Piers' words, but it's words from other parts of the media at the moment about just turn the boats back when they're halfway across the channel. Why can't we do that? It's not a fix because that would be like painting over a crack in a wall rather than dealing with the crumbling foundations that led to it. And let me be clear what I'm saying here. The crumbling foundations are not the desperate humans risking their lives to get here. The crumbling foundation is the almost criminal inadequacy of this government's failure to ensure an asylum processing system that provides safe, tested and legal routes for arrivals. And then you get this breeding ground for actual criminal gangs to exploit people into making the journey here. Now, the 2 principal smuggling routes for migrants trying to reach the UK are from Syria into Turkey and from East, North and West Africa to Europe. Asylum seekers are then reportedly paying as little as £500 for a spot on a small boat to make the dangerous journey across the Channel from northern France to the coast in Kent. The UN estimates the global network of illegal migration generates a minimum of $6.75 billion a year for criminals, according to those estimates that they found. There is no single way people smuggling is done. It's myriad, but it often involves violence, threats, falsified ID documents, dangerous uses of lorries and boats for transit of people. In order to stop these criminals, we need action at every single stage of the journey that they take from the source country to the destination, and we obviously cannot do it alone. The saying goes, no man is an island. Well, technically, this country, the UK, is a big island or series of islands, but we cannot be entirely self-sufficient in this. It's a mistake to think we can just by strengthening our borders, like we're some sort of medieval castle that can pull up a drawbridge. Nor is it France's problem, just because they're our closest neighbour and the last point before many illegal migrants reach the UK. It is every single country and every authority at all parts of the journey, and that is going to take some serious grown-up international coordination. Last week, amid all this Bibby Stockholm nonsense, the government actually announced a deal with Turkey to set up a joint force centre there to disrupt and dismantle some of these horrendous people smuggling gangs. Now, if that is done right, I'd say that's far more important and useful than a big horrible barge off the coast of Dorset, which is nothing but a massive totem of failure and last resort. On tonight's show, we're going to understand a bit more about these criminal gangs, how they operate, how much they make, and what they do to people, and how they might be stopped. Joining me to discuss all of this is Dr. Andy Hodjay, an expert in EU law and migration at University College London. Also joining us here in the studio, socialist and author Grace Blakely. And we're also joined down the line by author and podcast host Konstantin Kishin. Konstantin, thank you. I'll start with you, seeing as you're there. You were just listening to my opener to the show there. Do you think that's fair that the government's just got its focus in the wrong direction here?
I think what we should be doing is working with countries like Turkey, Egypt, etc., to create refugee camps in those countries near the conflict zones, and then process the people there. But I'm afraid even when we do that, and even when we do create legal and safe routes, as you say, what will happen is some people will still try to get into this country illegally. So we are going to have to, you said we shouldn't think about strengthening our borders. I actually think we should. We should provide safe and legal means for people to apply. But there will still be people who want to come here by breaking the rules, and that should not be tolerated.
Yeah, I'd like to be clear on that. So strengthening borders, I do mean asylum processing. I do mean regarding each and every application thoroughly. I call that strengthening the borders, not necessarily military troops and things like that, which are sometimes suggested. I mean...
But the question you have to answer then, Rosanna, is once we have those safe and legal routes in place, what are you going to do with people who try to get in illegally when they will do? I'm afraid at the end of the day, we are going to have to find some way of preventing people from getting into this country. He mentioned we're an island. It actually shouldn't be as hard as it now seems.
Let's cross to some of our guests in the studio. Dr. Andy joining us, because you would deal in the very legal aspects of this. You deal with migration on a very real basis. Give us a sense of the criminal gang element to this, how serious it is.
It's quite serious because organized crime has arranged many of these trips. They still have a very strong foothold in France and across the wider region, which you were calling in Turkey, as well as the Western Balkan routes. And they're the one behind who actually organize the trips. What we saw from last year's crossing as well as this year's crossing, we could see how they advertise the routes actually in different languages. And they use all sort of social media networks and even in some local TV channels in different parts of the world where they are sort of advertising the routes. So they are fairly sophisticated in terms of how they organize the trip and how they promote their criminal activities. Now, the UK government has tried last year a little bit. This year, it seems to be a bit more prepared at the start of the summer season, because what we saw from last year, usually during the summer, it's where the numbers rise up, and we can see exactly the same this year. But it seems that still we are insufficient and ill prepared. And that would require a lot of collaboration with many countries across Europe, because what we can see, the route starts from Turkey up to France and they arrive here. So there's a number of countries that we can deal better and we can collaborate them, but also the countries where they come from. I mean, that's also the big question, right?
It's a huge international task requiring a hell of a lot of collaboration. Do you think this government's got it in them?
Well, at the moment, it seems they're playing catch up and they're merely reactive to a specific situation rather than preparing. One would think that this year they would be far more prepared than they were last year, but it seems that they did not learn from some of those mistakes. Now, we can see around Europe, even the European Union is having a discussion in terms of how it should allocate migrants, and they tried before the summer to make a new deal in terms of how they are going to allocate, and they still cannot fully accept or agree what would be the correct number, right? So that does also put a challenge in terms of for us. But the question per se, or in the debate, are we talking here about migrants as a numbers that they're coming here, or are we talking about migrants with problems? That has to be clearly defined. Because if we're talking about numbers, it's not per se the numbers, but what sort of skill set do these migrants have? What sort of integration programs we can provide for them? Because if they come with low skilled background, it would be really difficult to integrate them into our society, and that's something that the UK should not very much look forward to, right? So this really requires a lot of global efforts, and a proper study should be conducted. But so far, we seem that we are playing catch up along the way.
It feels catch up, it feels reaction. Like you said, it's not just about a numbers game. Humans are invariably incredibly different and can offer different things to a country and come from different backgrounds, have different stories about why they came here. Grace, in terms of the numbers, the government is out of control on this. The numbers have been rising rapidly over the last few years in terms of the number of illegal migrants that are making their way to the UK. Can you understand why this is becoming such a huge political issue?
Okay, I think we really need to kind of take a step back and look at the situation a bit more objectively, because the framing is always there's a migrant crisis, there's hordes of people coming over. Let's just bear in mind that the vast majority of refugees around the world are in the global south. They're in poor countries. They're largely in countries around conflict zones and around places where you've had these processes of long-term social decay, of war, of extreme poverty, and also now of climate breakdown. You know, these people are being forced out of one place and pushed into another. Now, some of those people are then able to make the long and dangerous route, a route which they ultimately think is going to be worth it, a route for which they save a long, long time, a route for which they often risk their lives to get out of what are often horrendous conditions in refugee camps in some of the poor parts of the world. They make their way painstakingly through all these different places, get around all these barriers to try and get to the UK. And the idea that somehow we would solve this problem by, as you say, kind of constructing a castle or like putting a fort around our country or doing like literally like building a wall around England is utterly absurd, isn't it? You know, it's the same with any of these questions around crime and prevention and illegality. If you just focus on enforcement and you don't think about what's driving the issue, if you don't think about what's driving people to try to come to this country, risking their lives to do so, paying lots of money to do so, and if you don't organise ways for that process to be handled cooperatively with the UK working with governments around the world, then nothing's going to change.
Let's bring in Konstantin on this. He's been listening in carefully to those comments made by Grace. Konstantin, because I would argue, and Grace, I will give you an opportunity to come back as well, that you've got to do both at the same time. Look at the source issue that causes migration, people to leave their own countries, but also deal with the issue that is very upfront, which is everyday thousands of people sometimes arriving.
Yes, well, we have to deal with both. I'm glad, by the way, that Grace made the distinction between refugees and migrants. I'm increasingly uncomfortable as we talk about these people as migrants. Some of these people are refugees. Many of these people are simply illegal immigrants. And as someone who followed the immigration system of this country to come here many years ago, I'm increasingly frustrated that we're conflating people who are breaking the law of this land to get here with everybody else who follows the process as they should. So that's the first point I made. The second point, I think you're right. We have to provide some method for people to apply in areas there already are, places like Turkey, like Egypt, etc. But then we have to recognize that not everybody who's attempting to get into Britain is actually a refugee. I mean, we've seen a huge influx of Albanians, for example. Albania is not a war-torn country. Albania is not a country that's a source of refugees, particularly. So there is different types of immigrants who are attempting to come here, different types of people. And we have to find them where they are, they can apply, and then we have to actually hear their claim. And not everybody is going to meet the conditions for refugee status. And we have to recognize that, yes, of course, we've got to be able to help people. But on the other hand, not everybody who's attempting to get in is actually going to qualify, which is one of the reasons that they're doing it illegally. If you think about when we talk about safe and legal routes all the time, one of the things that people don't seem to say is there are plenty of safe and legal routes. You could simply go to a visa center and apply to get in here like any other immigrant. The reason people are doing this is many of them will not qualify, and we are going to have to reckon with that as well.
It is a reckoning. Look, I want to come to Dr. Andy in the studio because he's done a lot of work regarding Albania, and I think it's important that Konstantin and Grace have brought up the point of distinction between asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, illegal migrants, etc. When it comes to Albania, it is a country that has been in the press a lot because of the amount of Albanian migrants, legal, illegal or otherwise, have ended up here, and the government has tried the UK government to find a strategy to deter. How successful has that been with regard to Albania? So
we have to sort of distinction. I'm glad that we made the distinction between refugee migrants, but as well as those who have been trafficked in this country. When it comes to the case of Albania, the UK government in Albania did acknowledge that there was an issue around illegal migration, and they made an agreement. And what we found out, actually, the two countries didn't really have a lot of relation when it comes to specific issues such as migration. Both were member of NATO's, but we didn't see many collaboration. The moment that we saw both governments sat together and actually acknowledge that some of these issues could have been tackled together, we can see the numbers this year have reduced dramatically. So if we compare the numbers this year to last year, there is a decrease on the number. And that is because there was an acknowledgement. However, I can see the word being thrown around, well, what we did with Albania, let's do it with other countries. But we have to cut through a little bit on this. Do we think that we can make a deal with Afghanistan, how we did with Albania? Because the Taliban are in charge, right? And so far, no one is sitting with them, right? We see with Syria, in other countries as well. You just put the number of how many different nationalities have arrived this year, and many of them are countries that the UK doesn't have a very good or friendly relation like they did with Albania.
Yeah.
With Albania, it was very different, and it was possible to achieve it because both countries are NATO members.
Right.
And there were many, already the sort of political framework was already in place. It was just about putting a bit more effort.
Grace, I did promise to come back to you. We are shortly running out of time, but on that point of going to source, as you were saying, when Dr. Andy brought up the Afghanistan example there, the 6 migrants that died in the Channel over the weekend were from Afghanistan. Obviously, the chaotic withdrawal of US forces from Kabul, the Taliban taking over a few years ago, these are not quick fixes to an issue.
I think it's really important that we remember that it's not as easy for many people as just, showing up at an office of a government and then, applying for a legal route to get to the UK or to Europe. Because a lot of these migrants are from places where there is literally the absence of a state or a failed state or a crumbling state or a state that's in conflict or a pariah state or, a state which would simply not allow them to kind of even begin to start making that journey. So the distinction shouldn't just be illegality or illegality. It shouldn't just be how did they come into the country? Was it on a boat or was it on a train? It kind of doesn't make sense to categorize people in that way, does it? It should be where have they come from? What is their need? And how can we work to actually integrate those people into our society? Use their skills and the resources that these people have for the UK, because we need people to work in the NHS. We need people to do jobs for which we currently have large amounts of vacancies. So why not actually create those routes for people to come into this country, either because they are in need and they're fleeing conflict, they're fleeing war, or because they have the skills that we need, in the NHS, or potentially both.
Immigrants is basic economics. You need immigrants to prop up most countries and economies. It's been an interesting discussion. Grace, Dr. Andy and Konstantin, thanks all 3 of you.